My hands look giant. My hands are giant. Okay, that was stupid. Hello everybody, welcome to IB Films. Today we're going to be talking about camera settings for video shooters and filmmakers, so let's get right into it. So we're going to jump right into it with frame rates, and you're probably going to be given the option of 24 or 30 frames a second. 24 frames a second is what is used in pretty much every movie. It's become the standard. It looks most natural to us. 30 frames a second looks too smooth, but I've seen a lot of like vloggers and some YouTubers use it. But for me, my recommendation is to use 24 frames a second. Moving on. So next up, let's talk about ISO. Now, ISO controls how much light your camera takes in digitally. So if I turn it up right now, I can turn it up to 6,400 on my camera, and I can turn it all the way down to 200. Now, this is really nice if you're shooting in a place where you don't have light or good lighting. You can just bump that up. But as you can see, when I bump the ISO up all the way, we have grain in the image and we have noise. I can zoom in and show you what that looks like, but it normally doesn't look that good, and the colors can kind of shift a little bit as well. So you usually want to stay away from setting your ISO really high and just set up your lights first and then change your ISO. For example, now I have my light turned up all the way. My ISO is set at like 1,000. This looks a lot better and there's less noise. And I say it lowers the noise because it doesn't actually really get rid of it. There's still noise in the image. It's just less noise, because normally the lower your ISO goes, that's the cleanest it will be. So if I set this all the way down to 200 and had brighter lights, it would probably look better. Moving on. So next we're going to talk about Aperture. And so Aperture also controls how much light your camera lets in, but without noise at all. And this depends on your lens. Right now we're shooting on f-stop, which is Aperture's same thing, f4. And so I can turn it down and stop it down to f16, and now it's really dark. Probably moved the focus a little bit. Hopefully I'm still in focus. Yeah, but Aperture doesn't only control how bright the image is, it also controls something called depth of field. Depth of field is basically how blurry the out of focus area of your image is. So right now I'm in focus, the background isn't. You can see there's a little bit of blur, but we're shooting at f4, f being f-stop, which is Aperture, they're the same thing. So f4 is kind of blurry, not really. The smaller the number, so like an f1.7 would give you a blurrier background, whereas something like an f22 would give you a deep depth of field, which means kind of everything's in focus. People normally associate the film look with shallow depth of field, so the blurrier your image is, the smaller that number is, the more cinematic your image looks, which is true up to an extent. That's Aperture. Now we're going to move on to shutter speed. Shutter speed also controls your brightness, but it has some other effects too. The smaller your number is, the brighter your image will be, but the more motion blur your image will have. So let me show you. So right now I have it set, my shutter speed set to 10, and as you can see, there's a lot of motion blur in my hands right now. It looks very weird and strange. If I move around, it looks weird, and yeah, I look like an idiot. So the lower this number is, the more motion blur there will be in your image, but the same is true on the opposite end. So let me show you. Now I have my shutter speed set to 400, have my ISO bumped up all the way because it got really dark. So as you can see, the image gets darker, but also now there's no motion blur. So now everything looks very weird looking. My fingers look like they're moving really fast. Everything looks very high paced and very strange. And if I were to hold the camera, you're able to see how shaky it is, and it looks just very weird and strange and warping. Normally people use a higher shutter speed for like action scenes where like the punches look really fast and stuff, like everything seems very fast paced. So let's go back to a normal shutter speed, which I will talk about now. So now we're shooting on a normal shutter speed. So as you can see, there's motion blur, but there's not over the top motion blur. And so the way to know what you should set your shutter speed to is called the 180-degree shutter rule. Basically, whatever frame rate you're shooting in, you double that, and that's your shutter speed. So we're shooting at 24 frames a second. 24 times 2 is 48. and most cameras can't do 48, so we round up to 50. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, set your shutter speed to 50, and you'll get the most natural look. So bada bing, bada boom, those are some of the basic camera settings if you're just getting started in this whole video thing and you're overwhelmed by all the craziness of camera settings. Hopefully this helps you out, and if it didn't, I apologize, and there's probably other videos that can explain it better than me. Till then, this is IB Films, and I'll be back. I don't know, hopefully I'll be back. Honesty.